Chapter 5. He'd never imagined that when he opened the door to Brea Nelson looking like a kitten left out in the rain that he'd wind up with a Spitfire on his hands. He wasn't used to anyone being so willing to antagonize him, and so far it seemed to be all she was doing. The morning couldn't come soon enough, then he'd be done with her for good. He could make it through the night. It was nearly time for bed anyway. It had been a long and tiring day. He was exhausted. In fact, he was so tired that he wasn't thinking straight. That must be the reason why he found himself thinking that she looked especially attractive when she blushed, along with wondering just how far down that blush might go. George paused as he felt a stirring below the belt at the thought. Down, boy, what the hell was that reaction? Why, he'd slept with supermodels, for God's sake. How could a bedraggled little snow creature get a rise out of him like that? He shook his head. It was just because he was always horny, and there was no denying that she was attractive. Not his type, of course, but not bad at all. She was leaning over and petting Colby, which gave him the perfect view of her ass. A tiny part of him wanted to stride over to her and plant a firm smack on it. Excuse me. George jerked his eyes up and realized that she'd caught him staring. She was frowning as expected, but had her blush gotten a little deeper? He cleared his throat and crossed his arms, diverting the conversation smoothly as always. I just realized that there's an issue with the sleeping arrangements. She looked dubious. In this place, I bet you've got 10 bedrooms up there. Brea pointed over her shoulder at the gleaming blonde with staircase. If you bet that, then you'd lose, he said coolly. The only rooms upstairs are the master suite, a second bathroom, a room that I use as my office, and a room that I use as my gym. She frowned as if she didn't believe him. And he sighed in frustration. I told you this is where I come when I want to be alone. I don't bring guests here, so why would I be set up to accommodate them now? If you've got your heart set on sleeping upstairs, then you're welcome to bunk down on my weight bench, but all in all, I think you'll be more comfortable down here on the couch. Brea looked past him at the burgundy velvet couch. You mean that thing? It's as big as a king bed. Of course I'll be comfortable. Great, then that's settled, he replied, moving towards the massive storage chest that doubled as a coffee table. He'd found the thing on one of his business trips to Paris, a vintage steamer trunk that caused as much to ship home as it did to buy. George cleared the tray and expensive glass knickknacks his designer insisted he used to stage it, and opened it. These should work. He pulled out 2 thick cream-colored blankets, so soft to the touch that they almost felt like fur, then tossed them on the couch in a pile. He saw her startle out of the corner of his eye. Thank you, you're welcome, he said curtly. I'll make sure to keep Colby away. Sometimes he likes to sleep in front of the fire. No, you don't have to. Brea said his company would be welcome. George whipped his head to stare at her. She was baiting him again. There's a powder room just down that hallway by the front door, and if you need a shower, use the bathroom upstairs. Go up to the landing, and it's the first door on the left. The thought of her stripping down to shower derailed him for a few seconds, but he shook it off. I'll be fine, she answered, petting Colby. Again, thank you for your hospitality. Damn it, she just didn't quit. Good night. Then he turned to leave and whistled for Colby. Sorry, one more thing, she said, stopping him in his tracks. He turned to her slowly. What more could the woman possibly want? A pillow, please. He gave her a curt nod. Just a minute. It felt so out of sorts for him to be the one servicing her. He wasn't used to anyone making requests of him when there was staff to take care of it, but there wasn't any staff here. He was stuck alone for the night with a woman who'd shown up on his doorstep to torment him. He padded up the stairs and headed into the master suite, snatched a pillow from his oversized bed, then stomped back down to the great room with Colby wagging along behind him. When he reached her, he realized that she looked different. She dropped her hair down over her shoulders, and the thick reddish-brown waves framed her face and draped halfway down her back. She'd pulled off the oversized sweater and wore a simple black tee underneath, tied against her small firm body. The firelight made her features glow, and the flames were reflected in the small wireframe glasses that now sat over the bridge of her nose, framing her jade green eyes. He stole a glance down her body and then chastised himself for it. He had enough problems in his life without drooling over a woman who clearly despised him. He stalked closer and wordlessly handed her the pillow. He turned abruptly, but she stopped him with a hand on his arm. "Thank you," she said, her chin tilted upwards towards him, and good night, was all he offered. All he was thinking about was finally putting his head down on his remaining pillows, and waking up, when this endless day was finally behind him, when she called up to him, stopping him at the foot of the staircase. "Mr. Clark." Reluctantly, he turned to face her. "I understand that this is an inconvenience for you, but is it completely necessary to show your disdain for me?" He'd had enough. "And is it necessary, Ms. Nelson, for you to show your disdain for me? With every word you say and every misguided assumption you make, you choose to believe the worst of me, even when you're forced to admit that there's nothing you actually know about me, and while I may not be the ideal host, the fact remains that you are in my home, you've eaten my food, and you will be sleeping under my roof safe and warm, rather than being stuck outside freezing to death in the cold. Do you really think that sneering at me and accusing me of not being as nice as you seem to feel you deserve is the proper way to behave as a guest? Especially in the home where I came to be alone, not feeling up to being around other people after someone tried to kill me. If you want to think I'm some kind of ogre, then go ahead, but I'll thank you not to scold me like a misbehaving child as you stand there reaping the benefits of my hospitality, such as it is. I believe that I have been more than accommodating, and would appreciate it if you do not expect things of me that I am not required to give." He turned to walk up the stairs, but her voice stopped him once again. "I understand that it isn't required of you, I only think that it would make my stay here a bit more pleasurable for the both of us if you did more than just tolerate me." She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in. "With George, we aren't friends, Ms. Nelson. You are in my home temporarily, but if you are not satisfied with your treatment here, then feel free to take your chances with the storm. However, if you would like to take advantage of the generosity that I do offer to you, then in the morning when he paused, searching for the word. He didn't want to call them bodyguards, though technically they were. He couldn't say friends, because they certainly weren't. That he wouldn't deceive himself into believing that they cared for him in any way other than for their paychecks. "When my associates return, they can assist you with getting back on the road, and you will no longer have to concern yourself with my poor manners. Until then, good night." He could feel her searching for something more to say, but he gave her no opportunities. When he finally reached his bedroom, he slammed the door, and immediately regretted it, not because it could have startled the bossy interloper currently sleeping on his pillow, but because it revealed his emotional state. Something he worked hard to hide around people he didn't trust, but damn it, he wasn't used to having to keep his guard up here. His grandfather had built this cabin as a gift to his new wife, and once he'd passed away, the old place had fallen into disrepair. Even though his parents could have used the money, they'd refused to sell it, wanting him to have it when he was ready. He had happy memories of spending time here. This home was his refuge, his place to get away from it all. It might not be as grand as his mansion or as flashy as his penthouse apartments, but it had a warmth and a feeling of safety to it he'd never quite found anywhere else. That feeling seemed absent tonight, not because of what had happened at the gala that day, because of the ridiculous woman afloor beneath him. He climbed into bed. The sheets were cold against his skin, but the fire crackled from across the room. He knew that the heat would soon fill the room and the cool sheets would become a relief. Until then, he shivered against the silk brushing against his naked body. He stretched, allowing his muscles to feel the tension before pulling a pillow beneath his head and watching the dancing light on his ceiling. He thought of the woman below on his couch under his blankets. He wondered if she was as naked as he, and then quickly shoved those thoughts aside. He wasn't going to think of her in that way. As he felt the tug at his abdomen, the stretch of thin skin as his grew hard, he knew that it was too late. He didn't make commitments, didn't make friends, didn't have relationships, and that was just how he liked it. He had no time for concerns other than his business, and had no remorse for his actions outside of it. This was what he had wanted out of his life, and he was more than happy with it. He'd made it a point to avoid women such as Brea, women who challenged him. His women weren't like that. His women were pleasing and accommodating and wanted nothing more from life than what he could give to them in their short time together. They used him, he used them. So why then was he stiff as a bone for her right now? Why were thoughts of her potentially lying naked against his couch making him ache. Why did the image of her watching him over the rim of her glasses make him want to grab a fistful of her hair, yank her head back, and slam his mouth on top of hers? George groaned involuntarily as he shoved back the sheets, covered in a cold sweat, and yanked his pants back on. Willing his erection down, he realized that she'd sent him so off-kilter that he'd forgotten to add logs to the fire downstairs. Before storming to his room, he always kept the thermostat off when the fires were burning, so he could only imagine how cold the great room would get as the night wore on. As much as he didn't appreciate her presence, he wasn't about to leave her to shiver for half the night. He opened the door and walked back down the stairs to the woman that he was determined to convince himself that he didn't want.